Hello, hello. Welcome to the Board of Directors of the Redevelopment Agency of Salt Lake City, March 19th meeting. Our meetings are public, and everybody is welcome to join us in person or using Zoom, or by watching our City Council page, social media as like Facebook, YouTube, NSLC TV. I hope you can continue to join us whichever manner you feel more comfortable with. We begin with our comment section, comments to the board, and I would like to remind everybody that written comments might be submitted to the RDA offices via mail to P.O. Box 145476, Salt Lake City, Utah 84114. Or you can also send your comments via email at council.comment@slcgov.com, or by calling our 24-hour phone line, which is 801-535-7654. Thank you for joining us. And before we start, I want to remind everyone about the rules of decorum, which are in place to ensure our meetings move along well and to help everyone feel comfortable sharing their comments. A copy of the full rules of decorum are available at the door or online for those that are joining us online. If you would like to make a general comment today, we're accepting comments in person and online using Zoom. Scott Corpany from our council staff will moderate our Zoom and will will message you with any questions that you have about your registration. If you do need to speak with our staff, please select Scott from the list of participants. If you need to, you can also raise your hand in Zoom to indicate that you need something from the host. The staff is handling many tasks, so please limit messages to technical issues and minimal information updates. Taylor Hill and our staff will be calling those who wish to comment based on the order we receive the names. If you are on Zoom, please unmute your mic when Taylor calls your name. We will now open our general comment period. Taylor, please start with our first comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There is one person registered to speak. That will be David Talbot, who's here in person.
Good afternoon, Board. It's a pleasure to be in front of you again. Again, representing the Alliance House. Today, we will be reaching out for the $500,000 of the HDLP funding. Just a reminder, our program is not just about affordable housing. We really are building a community that gives our members a chance to change their lives and be part of our community on a broader scale, and really have us the opportunity to get out of that mental health stigma and to really grow and inspire to do bigger things. So we would appreciate your support in accepting our funding. Secondly, I just want to thank the council members who've taken my advice at the city council member meeting a couple of weeks ago and have scheduled tours to come visit and learn more about our program and this project. And we look forward to hosting you. Thank you.
I believe that that's our last comment. We're moving on the agenda to item C1, which is Informational Housing Development Fund Strategy, fiscal year 2024-2025. Alison Rowland, Council Policy Analyst at the table, Tracy Tran, Senior Project Manager at the RDA, and Lauren Parisi, Senior Project Manager at the RDA at the table. It's your time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is, as you mentioned, the Housing Development Funding Strategy for fiscal year 24-25. I just wanted to mention a couple things, especially for the newer council members. There will be continuing discussions on these funding allocations over the next month or two, and then it will become part of the fiscal year 25 budget. So this is just an introductory conversation, getting your feedback, and then in the next two briefings, we'll actually be allocating the FY24 funds for the HDLP, the Housing Development Loan Program. So we're kind of going in reverse order here, seeing an introduction of where these funds come from, and then you'll be allocating the previous year's funds during the next briefing. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. We do have a slide deck, if we could get that pulled up. All right, great. So we'll just get started. So we are here today to propose and have an initial conversation. Oop. Sorry, okay. Initial conversation regarding the RDA's annual housing development funding strategy. Next slide. So before diving into this year's proposal, I'd like to provide some background information regarding the RDA's housing policies, funds, and current housing data. To begin, the RDA's housing allocation funds policy, which was adopted in 2021, establishes the RDA's 4 housing funds that you see here, including the Primary Housing Fund, the Secondary Housing Fund, the Westside Community Initiative Fund, and the Housing Development Fund. Each of these funds have unique funding sources, eligible uses, and policy priorities. The housing funds allocation policy also dictates that prior to the annual budget process, the RDA Board of Directors adopts a housing development funding strategy made up of 3 major components, including 1, the projected amount of revenue to be allocated to each of the 4 housing funds for the upcoming fiscal year. These figures will be brought to the board at an upcoming meeting and are ultimately approved as part of the adoption of the RDA budget. Number 2, there's the annual housing priorities for the upcoming fiscal year. These priorities must be approved via a separate resolution, which will be brought back to you next month, and Lauren will give a little overview of those housing priorities later on in this presentation. And 3, the annual housing activities for the upcoming fiscal year. Funding for specific activities will be approved as line items within the RDA budget. Today's conversation will be focused on determining your housing priorities and activities for the upcoming fiscal year. This information will then help guide the funding allocation brought to the board for your approval. Next slide. So we thought it might be helpful just to break down the sources of these housing funds a little bit more in detail. So the first fund, the Primary Housing Fund, is sourced by tax increment required to be used for affordable housing and be used anywhere citywide, and that's pursuant to state code from each project area. So for example, State Street requires that at least 10% of the tax increment from the State Street project area goes to citywide affordable housing. The Secondary Housing Fund is sourced by additional tax increment that the RDA decides to allocate to housing that goes above and beyond the state mandate. And 3, there's the Housing Development Fund, which is sourced by sales tax revenue or funding our future dollars in addition to other sources, and is used primarily for the RDA's Housing Development Loan Program. And finally, we have the Westside Community Initiative Fund, which is sourced by Inland Port Housing Funds and are focused on areas west of I-15 to mitigate the impacts of the Inland Port. Next slide. So before diving into our funding strategy proposal, I want to give a recap of our housing priorities and activities for fiscal year 24. The priorities for this current fiscal year include wealth building opportunity, affordable family housing, deeply affordable housing, and missing middle housing. Some of the activities we were focused on include prep work on acquisitions and dispositions. We've continued working through issues and next steps on our Montrose property and the Sugar House DI properties, which will have an affordable housing component. For the property we own near 400 South and 900 West, we're close to closing on some additional parcels nearby, and we envision some form of housing being incorporated into that project. In August, the RDA board allocated $10 million in ARPA funds to the Perpetual Housing Fund of Utah to carry out a tenant wealth building program. And through the HDLP, $13.7 million was released to fund affordable housing developments, and the board will actually review this item after this item. For the ADU partnership item, RDA staff released a request for information, and a NOFA for an ADU program will follow. And we'll continue to work through a lot of these activities and priorities in the upcoming months and year. So to guide this year's, next slide, please. And so to guide this year's funding strategy proposal, staff has reviewed current housing data as well as the city's housing goals. Just wanted to give a brief shout out to our data manager, Eric Holmes, who has started collecting and building some cool tools to track the city's affordable housing investments. This is a little preview of some of the data he's collected, and we'll plan to bring what he's been working on in a future meeting. So this is some data that shows where all of the deed-restricted affordable housing developments are located within Salt Lake City. So this is regardless of whether there are city funds involved. This just shows any deed-restricted project within Salt Lake City. Next slide. All right, this next map shows all city-supported affordable housing constructed since 2015 and just future developments that are coming. So these are all projects that have either received a housing loan or some other funds, other like HUD funds, or a permit, or sorry, I lost my train of thought. a permit reduction fee. So those are all of those there. And then next slide, please. All right, and these are all the types of housing units by size and by affordability that the city funded since 2015. So as you can see, there have been a lot of one bedrooms. In the last couple years, we have really tried to focus more 3 and 4 bedrooms so that we can see more family size housing. And in terms of affordability, you can see a range. We've funded anything from 20 to 20% AMI and to some market rate. But there has been a lot of, we've been targeting a lot of like 40 to 60% AMI developments. Next slide.
Tracy, I have a question. On that previous slide, you're showing units by affordability. And so I know that we've funded some mixed income housing. Is that where the market rate units are coming in?
Yes.
We haven't funded any like the whole building is market rate, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of these are mixed use or mixed income units.
I just wanted to make sure that that's clear for the public, that those are in one project. We funded part of that project, but some of the units were affordable and some were not.
Yes, that's correct. Mm-hmm. All right, next slide, please. All right, and this is just a snapshot. So we shared this information last year. So this is a comparison of this fiscal year with what we showed last year of kind of Salt Lake City, a snapshot of Salt Lake City's housing. So we have the median household income that has increased a little bit. Median home value has stayed relatively the same. However, median rent has gone up a little bit. The low-income households, number of low-income households has still about stayed the same. The number of cost-burden households has also increased a little bit. And it still shows that there's an affordable unit gap of 17,000 units, so that has increased. So this is showing that there's still a lot of need to fund affordable housing in the city. Next slide. And here are some other metrics that we wanted to share. So this first one, this shows home ownership rate is growing at a slower pace than rental rates. So as you can see on the gray bar, that shows the renter occupied rate, and that's definitely increasing a lot more than the home ownership rate. Next slide. And this one shows that at least 8,341 renting households fall in the extremely low income limit that's set by HUD for fiscal year 23. So that's still a large percentage of people who fall within the extremely low income bracket. Next slide. This shows the percentage of households that have been decreasing since 2018. So the number of family households the percentage of that has been decreasing. However, the number of those living alone has been increasing through the years.
Just one more question. On the last several slides, are those localized for Salt Lake City or are they county data?
The comparison chart?
Just all the graphs that we've looked at the last 4 or 5 slides.
I believe this is Salt Lake
city-specific data?
Yeah, let me see if our data person is.
I see Eric saying yes,
yeah.
so
thank you.
Thanks.
Great, and yeah, so this one is showing the kind of decrease in families in Salt Lake, and then the increase of more single units. Next slide. And this shows that higher income households making $75,000 or more have increased within Salt Lake City through the years, and lower income households making less than $50,000 have decreased. So just some interesting data points. Next slide. This metric shows that the number of commercial parcels have decreased within Salt Lake City. So as you can see, since 2016, there's been just a little bit of a drop in the number of commercial parcels. Next slide. And then this shows that commercial growth rate is slowing while occupancy and lease rates have increased. So these are some really interesting figures. We can see that the availability of vacant square footage has gone down, though the lease rates and vacancy rates have, the percent lease rate is actually going up. So it's at a 96% lease rate. It's just some really interesting data points that you can dive into a little more. Next slide. And this is just a summary of all the last 6 points that we went through. Again, all of this is in your packet, so you can dive into that a little more. And next slide. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lauren to dive into our housing goals and our priorities for the year.
Great, thanks, Tracy. Okay, here we go. All right, so in addition to all that data, we also look to the city's master plans and goals when proposing annual housing priorities. So this upcoming fiscal year, the mayor is focused on completing the 2-year action plan for Thriving in Place, which you all know is the city's anti-displacement strategy. And in this plan, the RDA is specifically tasked with producing just more affordable units generally, helping tenants become owners, and preserving existing affordable units in the city. We're also tasked with completing an ADU pilot program, and we are currently working on that, and we'll bring it to you all soon. The mayor, again, is also very focused on housing for families in particular, which is encouraged as a part of the city's housing plan, as well as our RDA benchmarks that we utilize. And finally, our benchmarks also highlight the need for commercial spaces, especially affordable commercial spaces, to support those people moving into the housing units that we're creating and really to make a community. Next slide, please. So with that, the proposed housing priorities for the upcoming fiscal year include wealth building opportunity to promote upward mobility through mechanisms like homeownership, deeply affordable housing. As we've seen in the data, there is still a great need for those types of units. And of course, we define this at 40% AMI or below. Affordable family housing. And this year, we've tweaked it a little bit to add that this must include amenities for children. And then finally, we've added neighborhood commercial and services to, again, support all of the people living in these housing units that we're building. Next slide. So on to the housing activities. To support the priorities, we intend on releasing a kind of a special notice of funding availability specific to equity building projects that don't tend to meet the underwriting terms in our other annual NOFA that we release, which is more catered to rental housing projects. So that's one activity we'd like to focus on this year. And then we'll also, of course, continue to release that annual NOFA through the Housing Development Loan Program. Again, that's catered toward rental projects. And finally, we'll continue to buy and release properties for the development of housing that incorporate these specific priorities. And so we have a few kind of on the near horizon. Next slide. So like last year, really this year that we're in now, the rental housing NOFA will require that projects include a portion of family-sized housing, which we define as 3 or more bedrooms, and amenities, and then, or they could also include a portion of deeply affordable units. We considered incorporating commercial space as a requirement for the NOFA, but after consulting our Redevelopment Advisory Committee, the RAC, they really encouraged us to encourage it versus require it. And so we'll give more points to projects that do have commercial space versus requiring it as a part of our rental housing NOFA. Next slide. So this table just shows which tools or activities accomplish what priorities. Kind of a quick rundown. Next slide, please. And then again, just as a reminder, the annual housing funding strategy is broken up into these 3 components. Next slide, please. And we did want to relay the information that we received from our Redevelopment Advisory Committee. They gave us a lot of good feedback, and which included, at a high level, they really liked looking at all of the data that Tracy presented, and they suggested establishing really standardized metrics to look at annually to be able to assess whether or not kind of our programs are working. And they also suggested possibly allowing more time in between benchmarking to, again, kind of understand better if our programs are working. They commented that perhaps family housing doesn't necessarily need to always have 3 bedrooms. It could have 2 and be sufficient, and that those larger units tend to lease slower than some of the other units. And they suggested encouraging commercial space instead of requiring it, which I mentioned as a part of our HDLP NOFA. And then finally, they talked a lot about coupling financial incentives with zoning incentives, which you're all familiar with, like reduced impact fees and reduced parking to incentivize affordable housing. Next slide. So the goal for today is for you all to discuss these priorities and provide feedback. Do these priorities encapsulate city goals and projects? And then next month, staff will bring back the priorities to you all for formal adoption, and the housing activities are approved as a part of the RDA's annual budget. So with that, I'll just open it up for your discussion and questions. Thank you.
Anybody?
Thank you very much for the presentation. And reviewing the 4 priorities from previous years, and I like the addition on the affordable housing about the amenities for the children. I think that was probably a very wise decision to make, because we talk about housing, but we also talk about affordable living and amenities for kids. If they're all, you have to drive to get there, then they're really not affordable. So it's nice that you add that into that mix, and it'd be nice to somehow make sure that is weighed even higher than just if it's affordable housing, family housing. And I also like the comment about family housing can be 2 bedrooms too.
Okay. Right?
Because, family sizes are getting smaller. Kids are allowed to share bedrooms.
Some of us remember that, Mr. Chair.
Can I ask you a question about that, though? I feel like the free market is really well taking care of the studio to 2-bedroom. The 3-bedroom is what's being left out by the free market. And since our dollars aren't that large in comparison to what's going on in the market, it does feel like on our projects, that focus is not misappropriated, because we still have some families, mine included, right, yours included, who, like, his kids are all sharing in 3 bedrooms, right? So I feel like because we have such a a relatively small pool of funds that are going to impact the city in a very niche way, that I'm a little bit hesitant to let go of that criteria. The free market is not doing that for us without our intervention.
Yeah, good point. I agree. You're right. 3-bedroom is, but I'm just looking at that. Families can still be a 2-bedroom, but there's a very
agree.
small. There's
That's
a very
true.
small number that need a 3-bedroom and a 4-bedroom. And I think the presentation also said that those do also go very slowly, so they can also just sit open, or they end up going to, I don't know.
I mean, 3 bedrooms can also be split by 3 college students who are
Right.
sharing, right?
Exactly.
So
Or 4
having more bedrooms doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be empty, but it does offer optionality. And this is probably data that's impossible to get, but it would be interesting to find out if the availability and the current plans to build those units match the families that still would require them in a reasonable calculation, right? Families that have more than 2 kids.
Or what's the vacancy rate on 3 and 4-bedroom rents?
Right. Like, I don't know if, are those data points that are even possible to get?
Is the vacancy rate the same across all 4 sizes, from studios to 4, 3 bedrooms? Or not? I don't know.
Mr. Chair, I don't know that vacancy rate actually in this case is the best metric, because there are fewer 3-bedrooms. There are also fewer people looking for 3 bedrooms. But when somebody is looking for a 3-bedroom, it also doesn't exist in the way that it's not like there's a plethora of 3 bedrooms sitting vacant. It's just that it takes them long. I think what they actually said is lease up times are longer, which makes sense. I don't think that there's a bunch of them sitting there vacant. It's just that when you put a new building on the market and there's some 3 bedrooms, it takes longer to find someone that fits the 3-bedroom than the 1 and 2 bedrooms. But that doesn't mean the need isn't there. It just takes longer to find the match, I think, if that makes sense. Correct me if
That's correct. Yeah, the lease up is slower.
so it's lease up, not vacancy rate, if that makes sense. I appreciate the conversation. I will say, just in my private practice, talking to developers looking at this, there is an intention to do 1 and 2 bedrooms, even if it's a market rate project, or slightly affordable. There is much more of a hesitation from private home multifamily developers to put in 3-bedroom apartments on their own. So I do think that our incentives encourage that a little bit more. So I guess I'm sort of leaning towards the end of the
I
conversation.
don't like it being a hard and fast rule.
Well, and
like,
it's
if
not
you
a hard
don't
and fast
have it,
rule.
then you can't. But
What the rule
don't
was,
wanna
I
go for it.
believe, you must either have deeply affordable or 3-bedroom plus, one or the other, but not both, right?
I also think affordability on 3 bedrooms, as someone who has had to look for at least that, if not a 4-bedroom, is really difficult, especially because paying for that many kids at this point is becoming increasingly unsustainable for families. So I think anything we can do to create not just the space, but the space at an affordability is probably in the best interest of our constituents with our restricted dollars.
Yeah, I'm not saying anything against, the 4 priorities are top notch. I think it was just a question about the family size being, can go down to 2 bedrooms, but I would not adjust the priorities there. And I like the idea of the amenities for the kids on the 1.
It is funny that when we open up for comments, you were all very shy to start, and now you couldn't keep it together. Sarah, you're
So I'll just, I guess, close out that comment. I do think that if we are focused as a city on bringing families back into the city, and we go back to the map, especially of where a lot of the city projects are, those 2 things seem to go very hand in hand. Like, we want to create units that allow for the families to be able to come back and, be a part of what it will be our thriving downtown. So I appreciate the inclusion of that, to be able to make sure that our actions with our dollars match the actions that are being stated. So.
Mano.
So I guess, can you compare what the proposal is for this year what's changed between last year and this year? Can you just highlight those pieces again?
Yeah, so the only thing that's changed is the missing middle. piece. That's not listed as a priority for this year, but we are continuing to work on some missing middle items on the ADU financing program that's required. So instead of the missing middle, that's replaced with the neighborhood commercial and services priority.
So last year we had a missing middle goal, and we've removed that and replaced it with neighborhood commercial.
And I would just add that we kind of also were thinking that the wealth building opportunity kind of takes missing middle into consideration.
Missing middle is a complicated term because it's
Yeah.
it could be talking about the size, but it could also be talking about the affordability.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I guess I understand those directions. I appreciate that we're adding commercial into that because that's something that's been hard to get included in some projects, and I think that really helps the livability of our neighborhoods. I wonder if if it can be like affordable commercial as another step in helping both it not sit vacant forever, but also like if our money's going to help support affordability, I think it could be in the commercial level as well. I probably agree with the Finance Committee that we encourage the commercial use and not require it in all of them, specifically because not all of our zones allow commercial uses, nor would it be appropriate for commercial in all zones where residential would be appropriate and where we should invest in residential affordable units. So I kind of agree with them that it shouldn't be a requirement, but more of an encouragement. If it's okay, I wanted to ask one more question that wasn't highlighted in the slides, unless anyone wants to sort of chime in on the one thing that I wanted to bring up in this conversation is, I think in looking through the last couple of years of NOFA recommendations from the RDA Finance Committee, they've put a really big emphasis on whether or not LIHTC credits were already approved. And I just want to have a conversation with the board about that, because I think that that's actually a pretty big policy direction that we haven't made as a board. And basically LIHTC credits, so the way I understand it, and I'm not an expert at this, but there's the 4% credits that are pretty easier to get, and then the 9% credits are the ones that the RDA Finance Committee is looking for. Those are limited in amount each year, and there's a process, competitive application process to get through those. But once those are approved, that project's getting 9% for 10 years, so 90% of their hard costs, basically upfront from their tax credit investor. Now, it depends on the market rate of tax credits and all that stuff, but they're getting a huge chunk, almost the full construction cost built. And so to me, that's great. And those projects do still have a gap, so they do still need RDA financing sometimes. But I just want to weigh whether like all the federal and the state investments going into the one project, and we're saying we're only going to invest in those projects that the state and the federal government have already invested in? Or should we say, let's look at the 4% bucket and prioritize that as well, because those are not being as fully funded, right? Like the decision that's being made is that all the money's going into a few specific projects, as opposed to we could also spread our money out to projects that are not quite competitive enough for the 9%, but are still really good projects. Did I say that way too high level, or go ahead?
So
I'm not the chair.
Sarah?
Chair, I have a follow-up question.
Yes, please.
So I think my question for Board Member Mono, is the reason that there is a preference towards supporting those projects that are already receiving that, is that, calculated based on risk? Like, it would be helpful for me to kind of understand, like, what is the spectrum of risk on including additional projects?
The way I understand it and the way it's explained to me, but I would love RDA staff to respond, if it's okay, Mr. Chair, is that the Finance Committee is looking at readiness, and they consider a project that has been awarded 9% tax credits as like the most ready to to break ground because they have most of their funding committed and they want the dollars out the door as quickly as possible. And we may all agree with that and want to continue that. And if we do, I think we should put that in our actual policy. But it's not something that we've ever voted on or decided. And I'm not sure that that's the only measure of readiness, and that readiness is more important than trying to get more units all together, even if they're not quite as deeply affordable. So the 9% projects are generally going to have a higher level of affordability, or a deeper level of affordability. So there is, it's not unreasonable for us to say we want to invest in those ones first, but there are projects that are still really good in meeting these goals that we want, but just aren't quite competitive enough for the 9%. And maybe our dollars would go even further to help those ones.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think one of the things you said that I'll just follow up on, I think kind of understanding how we're capturing readiness and what some of those other options are would be helpful for me to be able to then kind of understand what other factors we might consider, or if we do just kind of stay with the status quo in terms of how it's moving forward.
Yeah, so I'll try to answer some of that. So in terms of the Housing Development Loan Program criteria, readiness is one piece of that. And that has been the focus of Finance Committee the last few years, because they don't want funds to be held up. There has been an example where we had allocated funds years ago, and if projects don't get the tax credits, it just sits there. So that's like one thing they're trying to prevent from happening, is for funds to just sit there when it could go to a project that is ready. So readiness is one piece. They're also looking at like the developer, let me look up the full list, but it's the developer experience, the overall project, the design of the project, and then I have to double check, but there is a list. It's not just readiness, but readiness has been the focus, is usually the one that comes to the top, because they don't want projects to be
What about
held up.
projects that, do we not even get these projects in the door? But I imagine we do, but what about projects that are not planning to seek 9% tax credits, are only planning to seek 4% tax credits, but still have a gap? How's the Finance Committee looked at those? I guess A, do we get those, and B?
Yeah, we do receive those, and usually if they have received their 4%, they're more likely to get funding too. Get it like it's another readiness piece. But yeah, there are some pros and cons to, I think, the approach you're thinking of. I think one, you don't want funds to be held up for too long. So maybe if you wanted to go that approach, there's like a limit. Maybe a 2-year limit or a 1-year limit for how long it can sit there.
I see the benefit of, if the project says we need 9% tax credits to pencil, and we have not yet been awarded those, then we shouldn't be putting our dollars in those projects, because that does tie it up, because there's no guarantee they'll ever get those dollars. But if they say we can move forward with this project without 9% tax credits at a different level of affordability or whatever, I don't think that should disqualify them from getting funds from us.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate the conversation, because we kind of had this conversation just this past week with RDA on that exact same topic about the readiness side of the house. And if you look at the projects that we have here, some of them didn't get full funding. They got the 9% or they got the 4%, but they didn't need the full funding to still make their project ready to go and move out quickly. And so we felt comfortable with funding them at a lower level, because they still were able to fill their needs with that. And I agree that it's nice to have, I agree about the concept of desire to have, maybe not give funding to the ones that have 9% to the 4%, but sometimes it's also nice to stack that one up with 9% and move it out quickly than to maybe delay on something with a 4% that maybe is only a 1-year delay, but there is a delay. So I think there's a balance there, and I think the RDA and their staff has done a fairly good job of balancing those needs with the 9%, 4%, and the funding of what we need, and spread it out over 13 to 14 projects. And so I think they've actually taken your thoughts in consideration when they've done the financing.
Mr. Chair, I'm wondering if it would make sense, since this topic will come up in the next RDA meeting, to maybe give RDA staff some time to sort of organize their response, and then the board could discuss it again in April.
Yeah, that sounds great. I also have, we went over time, but I want to know more about what the board thinks the best approach for land acquisition and disposition on RDA interest, or and have a strategy about that and how to narrow down that strategy a little better. But I feel like it will, if we start with that now, we end up 8 p.m. tonight, so I might as well just schedule that out. Certainly, I have some thoughts, but I would like to pick everybody's brain and see where we land on that specific
Can
topic.
I clarify one thing? Sorry, for one of the criteria thing I forgot to mention is another really big thing that the Finance Committee focuses on is the number of project priorities that the project meets. So you'll see in the next round of our HDLP applications, each project receives like a weighted score. So if they meet different priorities like family size housing, missing middle, whatnot, they get certain points. And so I would say that's a combo of something they look at. They look at that top priority score along with the readiness of the project. That's usually the two big factors in their decision making. Any
final thoughts?
No, I appreciate that, and I'm excited for that conversation next meeting.
Do you need any specific, this direction on right now? Is just
No, just for discussion today, but we will be bringing it back next month, the 4 priorities for your adoption.
Yeah. Awesome.
Actually, I do have one final comment.
Okay.
I just think I'm not opposed to necessarily the way the Finance Committee has been doing it. I just want to make sure that our priorities are aligned with the way that it's happening, because I know that they've sort of added their own priorities, and I want to just make sure that we're all on the same board, on the same point, so that when I tell somebody in the community, this is what we care about, they're not then not getting funded by the Finance Committee because the Finance Committee cares about something that we didn't say.
Right. Thank you.
So just alignment is my number one goal.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Moving on now to item C2 and C3. Item C2 is the Resolution Housing Development Loan Program, a funding allocation for high opportunity areas, and C3 is Resolution Housing Development Loan Program, funding allocation for gap financing. We are adding Danny to the table, Danny Waltz, RDA Director, and Kate Ward, Project Manager for the RDA. And Allison.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
I'll give a little bit more of an introduction than usual on this one, just because we're talking about 20 applications, so it's a big lift, and the RDA staff has obviously done a ton of work on this. This is your opportunity to review and potentially approve recommendations for allocating up to $15.4 million in affordable housing funds among 15 proposed projects. And if we could get attachment C1 up on the screen, this is an attachment in your staff report. And I believe I sent it to you yesterday as well, yesterday evening. The idea here is to help get through all of the projects. Together, these projects recommended for funding would provide 1,540 units of new or refurbished affordable housing. And as you know, with that 15.4 million, the FY24 NOFA that was issued last year was unusually large because it combines funds from 3 different sources. One is the 4.2 million that was part of the RDA Housing Fund allocation, so what we just talked about. The second was 9.5 million of dormant federal HUD Home Investment Partnership, or home funds, which you shifted from the Housing Stability Division to the RDA HDLP in the FY24 budget. That was a bunch of acronyms. And then there's also potentially, should you approve it, 1.7 million of additional funding from 2 rescinded FY23 HDLP loans. And we can, the alphabet soup, yes. 2 loans that were approved last year for the NOFA that didn't have a chance to spend the allocation. And so by RDA policy, they needed to apply again. And I think RDA staff will be able to explain the details of that. So with all these funds available for allocation, that explains why the RDA staff is here in March requesting your input on this rather than doing it earlier. Basically, it took extra time to be able to incorporate all the HUD funds into the HDLP and make sure that the city was complying with federal regulations. So the FY24 NOFA was released in mid-November, and the applications were due on January 3rd. If you take a quick look at your attachment C1, it's very small on the screen, but I hope you can see it on your own screens. What I did here was simply rank the RDA committee recommendations. Sorry, I listed the projects in order of ranking by the Finance Committee. So that's the number that runs down the left side. There are 2 number 10s because they are considered part of the same project. And so that's why the highest number is 14 rather than 15. But these were 15 different applications. The other things just to note are that your council districts are included, the funding request versus the funding recommendation, the total number of units at different levels of affordability, and the weighted priority score, which is what Tracy was mentioning before, the extra points essentially that a project gets for meeting more of the board's priorities for any given year. The top 5 of those applications are the ones that rank most highly, and they're all recommended for full funding. The next 8 are the ones that receive minimum funding needed for the projects to advance. In other words, the RDA staff contacted each of the developers responsible and requested those and basically worked with them to make sure that they could still advance their project even at a lower funding level. And then the last project on the chart is not recommended, and it's in large part because the other applications were so good, and this one ended up with the lowest weighted project priority score. So for this briefing, we thought we'd combine this with the February high opportunity area NOFAs. So you may remember those, the 515 tower conversion and the Fairmont Heights 2 project. At the end of the day, the board will make the final determinations of which applications to fund in which amount. And you have several options for how you might want to proceed. I'm happy to help or try to help with any
Thank
questions.
You. Sorry, we're helping my companion here to find the documents. Thank you so much for doing that summary. That helps a lot. I appreciate that work, Allison. That meant a lot. How do you want to?
Well, I think RDA staff has their presentation, so they'll go a little more into specific projects and the decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison, for the great overview. One thing I just want to mention, I think the numbers you gave, in addition to that, there's the 2.7 million that we'll also go over. So it's almost 18 million that you'll be considering today. All right, thank you. Next slide, please. So this beginning portion, you've seen this before. We went over this last year, so I won't spend too much time on this, and then we'll dive into the competitive applications. So there's $2.7 million available. As mentioned, the RDA board set aside $4.5 million back in 2017 to focus on affordable housing in high opportunity areas. And high opportunity areas are defined as neighborhoods that provide access to resources that improve a person's chances at economic mobility. And in 2023, if you remember, MAP was updated to reflect newer data and metrics. So the area in blue there, that's what's defined as the new high opportunity area for the city. So the funds available have been open since 2018, and then we received 2 applications that we went over last month. So there's total requests for $5.35 million in these funds, but 2.7 is available. The first application is for 515 Tower Conversion Phase 1, seeking $2.65 million, and Fairmont Heights 2, seeking $2.7 million. And you'll see the location of those applications in the stars on the map to the right. Next slide. All right, and this is just a quick overview of the 2 projects again. The 515 Tower is developed by the Perpetual Housing Fund. The preliminary terms of this would be a construction to perm loan with a 2% interest rate, a 15-year term, and cash flow repayments. There's a total of 96 units that will be targeting 40 to 60% AMI and will include 1, 3, and 4 bedrooms. And they received a weighted score of 10. So this is the number of project priorities that this project meets, that they received 10. The other project is the Fairmont Heights 2, developed by Lincoln Avenue Capital. Lincoln Avenue Communities, there's a typo there. And this would be an acquisition, and that would convert to a acquisition loan that would convert to a construction to perm loan. The acquisition loan would be a 1% interest rate with a 2-year term, and then there would be a balloon payment or a conversion to the permanent loan at that point. The construction to perm would be a 16-year term with a 40-year AM with hard repayments. This project would have 55 units targeting 40 to 80% AMI, and will include 1 and 2 bedroom units. And they received 6 weighted points regarding their priorities met. The RDA Finance Committee did recommend to fully fund the $2.65 million request for 515 Tower Conversion Phase 1, and the RDA Finance Committee maintained this recommendation when they provided the funding recommendations for the competitive applications. So they assumed that this would be funded, and then they went ahead and did the other allocations for the other 13 projects. So one thing I wanted to note that came up earlier this year was a question about whether the use of backup emergency generators that typically use alternative fuel sources such as diesel or natural gas for emergency purposes, and it's sometimes also required by building code, if those would violate the RDA Sustainable Development Policy. We reviewed this with our attorney, and it was determined that as long as the project is designed and operated to be all electric, it would not violate the policy. So we wanted just to provide that clarification as we go through this housing development loan program process. Next slide. So I'm going to jump into the competitive housing development, NOFA. Again, these are our annual funds that we take to the board every year. This year, as Allison had mentioned, was kind of a record number of funds that we put out. We initially put out $13.7 million. 4.2 of that were RDA funds, and then 9.5 were HUD funds. Here's a breakdown of the funds. Just note the last category there, the home Community Housing Development Organization funds, none of the applications qualified for those funds, so those you won't be allocating any of those funds today. And an additional $1.665 million in RDA funds from last year's Housing Development Loan Program applications may be available, subject to your approval. Again, these funds come from a couple applications from last year's Competitive Housing Development Loan Program allocations that did not meet one of the conditions of their funding. So the RDA Finance Committee did assume that those would be folded into this year, but that would be up to the RDA board to make that final approval. Next slide, please.
Can I ask, Mr. Chair, what is the funds that we're not allocating today, what are those intended for?
Which,
the
sorry.
home
The community housing development.
Yeah.
Those are and I think Tony and
Explain.
So
yeah.
There's a
Maybe able to
specific
do it
HUD
decent.
requirement.
They are specific to certain development organizations that need to have the permission from a HUD to receive these funds. So it's a slightly higher level, it's a much higher level of interaction of the developer with HUD ahead of time. So those did not, none of the developers met that criteria, but it's been a problem in Salt Lake City for time. And Tony could explain more about that if you'd like.
Okay, maybe at another time, offline, I'd like a understanding more. of
Well,
that.
just quickly, those funds can be, in another year or so, used in the other home programs.
Yes.
We can take that funding, that $350,000, and allocate it to one of the other home programs in the later year. So we don't have to use it for that line item. We can actually move it to another line item.
Right, it has, I believe it was 2 years that it needed to be held essentially for any CHDO, and then after that time, there are less requirements on what it's spent on, and so Housing Stability and RDA are working together to figure out how to best use that.
Thanks.
Great, and just to go over the process, so for these competitive applications, the applications were released on November 17th, 2023. We held an information session on December 1st, and then applications were due January 3rd, 2024. In total, we received 20 applications. Five of those were ineligible, but 15 of those were eligible. So of the 15, they were seeking $27 million in eligible funding requests. Next slide. And this is just a map of the location of the proposed, or of the applications. This is the first map. And then next slide, you'll see the second map. And then next slide. Then I'll turn it over to Kate to give a little more overview of the Housing Development Loan Program requirements. And just so you know, a lot of the high opportunity funds also have a lot of these requirements, so this is kind of covering all of the applications.
Great, thank you, Tracy. So with these applications, they were required to meet some threshold requirements, and with our initial review of those items, you can see three items here that were you had to have sustainability met with all the projects, and then either family-sized or deeply affordable units needed to be included. As Tracy mentioned, there was a policy clarification that applies to both the high opportunity area and these competitive NOFA applications this year, that backup generators are not contrary to that policy, and that they can be used for emergency purposes. So that's both diesel and natural gas generators. To qualify for our sustainable development policy, new construction projects need to have an Energy Star score of 90 or higher, be 100% electric, and participate in the Salt Lake City Energy Benchmarking Program. For substantially renovated projects that are requesting between $200,000 and $899,000. They do not need to be 100% electric, but they do need to qualify for the other two items to receive that funding up to $899,000. There were a few rehabilitation projects that were included this year, so you may notice that when we look at their funding requests and the recommendations from the Finance Committee. With respect to the family-size units and the deeply affordable units, these two items, with one or the other being a requirement for the competitive NOFA, that came from your April 2023 RDA board decision to adopt the annual housing priorities. So with the family size units, three plus bedrooms for 10% of the units making 60% AMI or less, or that deeply affordable, which is 10% of the units with household incomes of 40% AMI or less. Let's go to the next slide, please. So we've spent a lot of time in the last presentation as well regarding these particular items. These are the project priorities that help us determine the weighted score of the individual applications. The top four items in that list are bolded because they received a ranked score of 3 points each this year, and the other items received a score of 1 point each. So that helped in determining which met the priorities that the board had set in prior years, or in the prior year, in determining how many of the project priorities were being in their weighted way met. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Here we have what the RDA staff looked for, as well as the Finance Committee in reviewing these applications. We have, with this, Director Mono brought up curiosity about what we are looking for. Section 3 of the housing guidelines, housing development program guidelines, includes those threshold requirements that we have here, and that project readiness, I think, is what the Finance Committee has frequently looked to when it comes to the tax credits. This year, we didn't have any applicants that were in the process of applying for 9% tax credits. We either have applicants that were awarded 9% tax credits, applicants that have been awarded 4% tax credits, or are applying for 4% tax credits, or applicants that are not applying for tax credits. The top ranked project is not applying for tax credits, just as an FYI. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so there were, of those 15 eligible applications, this is half of them. There's so many, we couldn't fit them all on one slide. It's all so small already. But what you can see here is the name of the development, who the developer is, their address, which you could see a little bit better on that map, the maps that Tracy showed. That first dark line shows their request amount. The line right below it shows the funding recommendation from the board. You'll see application number 4, which is Tower 515. We have some asterisks under that funding recommendation because that is recommended to be via the Finance Committee to be coming from your high opportunity area funds. Under that next dark line, you can see the affordable units breakdown for each of the individual projects based on their affordability levels. And then below the next dark line, you can see the breakdown based on the bedroom count. And the very last line has their weighted project priority score. So that's taking into account what project priorities were included and how they scored based on that. Let's go to the next slide. You can see the second half of the applications. I'll point out project number 10, application number 10, was the top scoring project, project Open 3, with a weighted project score of 12. And let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. So what we have here is all the projects, their address, that weighted project priority score, their funding request, and then all the different buckets of money except for the high opportunity area funds. And then you can see the red bucket is the RDA committed funds. That bluish purple is what you as a board may consider including, and the Finance Committee recommends that you consider including. And then the home program funds are in that yellow, with the green being the Finance Committee's total recommended funding. And that far right column, if the board considers any other changes to this, this is the funding ranking that the Finance Committee recommends to you, with 1 being the project that they would recommend funding first, and going down to 13 being the last funding or 14, excuse me, being the lowest ranked project. If these funding recommendations are followed, of the 1,786 eligible units that applied, the funding is recommended for 1,549 units. So with that, I will turn it over to the board for any questions and discussion. Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Quick request. Could I ask Scott to show the list of projects that were not recommended for funding? I forgot to do that earlier.
Thank you.
If you heard, Scott. It'd be attachment number 2 that I sent you. That's it, thank you. This is just a quick list of the applications that did not meet the eligibility requirements. There were 5 of them, which I think is also an unusually high number. But you can see them listed there along with the basis that RDA staff used to determine their lack of eligibility. So that's just for your information.
Any discussion on this?
So the one thing that's not on this list that we're looking at right now, Allison, is the one that wasn't ineligible but was not recommended for funding. Can I just ask a little bit about why that received such a low score? I think there's only one project that's not recommended for any funding that was eligible, right? So I think it's a weird year. That's weird, right? That's atypical.
Yes.
So it's really exciting that we're able to fund almost all of the requests that came in to us and how much we're able to fund. And that's probably due to the commitment of everyone in the city to finding funding for affordable housing. So first off, this is really exciting. I think the one that's not recommended for funding is in my district. And I'm just wondering if I get questions on that, can you help me understand why that one received such a low score?
Yes.
So that I can help educate whoever might ask me.
Great question. So what it came down to was these were all fabulous applications. It is a competitive process, and the other projects just included more project priorities than that particular project, and it did not include any of the higher weighted scoring priorities. So while it did have 3 priorities included, they all were worth 1 point each. That particular project also does have light tech that has been awarded to it. So just, you mentioned that earlier, but in order to meet the minimum funding requirements for all of the other applicants with the higher weighted project priority scores, they were not able to allocate funds there, to recommend allocating funds there.
So if I could translate that into words that looks like they have no 3 or 4 bedrooms. They didn't have any family-sized housing. They had a few that were below 40%, but it's a lower percentage of theirs than other projects may have included. I think that helps me understand. Thanks.
Okay. Allison, may you help us with some action on this item, because apparently it needs to be separated?
Yes. Not necessarily separated. Essentially, what you'd be voting on today is, 1, the total list of recommendations by the Finance Committee, or you could take that apart and make some changes in it. So you could say, we'd like it the way, we'd like to approve it the way the Finance Committee listed it with those funding amounts, or you could highlight specific projects where you'd like to shift around some funds. The other possibility, or rather the other thing that you should be aware of, is whether or not you want to include the high opportunity NOFA recommendation. So that's the 515 conversion, tower conversion. That is included on that list. That's the one that you discussed in February. And and the recommendation of the Finance Committee was to fund that particular project rather than I think it's Fairmont Heights 2 or 1, which was the other high opportunity application. And then finally, actually before that, you should probably have a motion to include the 1.65 million of additional funds from those funds that were rescinded from previous year's projects, unless you want to use them for something else. But you can use them for something else if you'd like. I did that in backward order, sorry. You want me to repeat it?
Yes.
So it could be a motion. So it could be a motion to include the 1.65 million and to adopt the resolution with the projects listed in the attachment, except for if you want to make some exceptions. But essentially, the resolution itself will add these projects on as an attachment, so you can just say which ones, and the attorney's office will make the magic happen.
I think maybe to simplify this, are there any changes that any of the board members want to make to the recommended?
No.
Okay, so it seems like then the motion is?
To adopt the 1.65 million.
Chair, I move that we adopt a resolution which would include the 1.6 million of unused previous year's NOFA funds in this year's NOFA, and approve the funding as recommended by the RDA Finance Committee for both the high opportunity area funds and the annual NOFA.
Second.
So I have a motion by Board Member Mano and a second by Board Member Dugan. Any discussion on this item? I'm gonna call the question. All of those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? This motion passes unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, guys.
Moving on to item C4, resolution RDA budget amendment number 2 for fiscal year 2023-2024. We're gonna welcome Beth Lutke, Council Policy Analyst. Danny Walls, the Director, stays at the table. And we're gonna welcome maybe some other staff members from the RDA.
Maybe.
Oh, yeah. So, and Cunningham, RDA Financial Analyst, and maybe Greg Clary, Budget Director. It's your time.
This budget amendment is budget neutral. It would reappropriate funding for several projects in the Depot District project area. The changes would align with the city's new Workday financial systems structure. And it would consolidate some of the funding into larger single appropriations. I'll turn the time over to Erin, who has a presentation.
Erin's happy to defer to me, and she's going to jump in to correct me on anything I get wrong. So if that's okay, if we can bring up the presentation. Okay. Ben did a great job of setting the stage for this. As we said, this is budget neutral. This is really just the purpose is to reappropriate several existing accounts into new project budgets. It maintains the total in appropriations, just splits it up differently. And then what you'll see as we go through these slides and explain that, we'll explain how that's happening within the context of the new structure that we're implementing as part of the Workday transition. So first slide, what you see here is essentially what exists right now currently as far as the appropriations. It is just under 13.5 million that is currently appropriated right now to Station Center, properties within Station Center or the larger Depot District area. This budget amendment focuses on just over 12.1 million of this total of 13.482. You'll notice on this slide that on the far left column, there is the different uses or status, I should say, of the accounts that we're talking about. If I can pull this up. Those are split between what is categorized as available funds, the rescope of appropriations, or what's in use. The in use is what exists right now within those 6 different project accounts. Those are projects that are currently underway, so those funds will continue to be drawn down from those appropriations, and that total is just over 1.3 million. Again, that is not part of this budget amendment 2. However, those funds will continue to be spent on those appropriations. The available funds at the top, the 3 lines within that, total just over 10.8 million. Those are categorized as available because those are appropriations that right now are not tied to a specific project. Under those, what is classified as rescope is appropriations that right now are categorized towards a specific project, but those projects are either projects that are no longer going to move forward, in the case of the underground power lines, projects that are done, and those are remaining funds, in the case of the Salt Lake Mattress Warehouse, or projects where the scope of those projects will remain as part of those 2 new projects, so those funds are just going to be consolidated along with other funds and reappropriated to those 2 new projects. Within this categorization also, you'll see how we've started to manage our appropriations within the transition to Workday. That framework, as far as appropriations, you can see in the column titled appropriation, where there's 4 key elements that we're adding to all of the budget appropriations that you as a board approve. The first is indicating the fiscal year that you as a board approve it and the funds are received, highlighted by here fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 23. I should note that our current year, fiscal year 24, is the first year that we've done this structure in alignment with Workday. So fiscal year 23 basically lumps together anything prior to fiscal year 24. We don't have the ability to go back in the past, so we've just put that all as fiscal year 23. So moving forward, you'll have a new fiscal year attached to every appropriation. The next item in the appropriation is the fund within which those funds are received. These are primarily our project area funds, but also include our housing funds, our multi-use funds, and our operations funds. So those will be applied to the appropriation as well. Next is what's considered the program, in this case, infrastructure improvements. These are the broad programs that we allocate funds to. This covers everything, as you see here: infrastructure, housing, acquisition, disposition, et cetera, et cetera. This is just that high level, what is the category and the program that we're appropriating funds to. And then finally is the region. The region is sometimes different than what is the project area or the source of funds. This is where the funds are ultimately spent. So most of the time that will be the same as the fund overall in the case of a project area, because typically we spend our project area funds within that project. But also in the case of either our multi-use funds or our housing funds, it could be spent elsewhere. So this allows us to track where those funds are actually spent, so that somewhere down the road, if you as a board or we were interested in understanding how much we ever spent total in the Sugar House project area, we could go back and look at that. So helps us kind of look at it both ways, from what we have to receive and put them to where they're ultimately spent. Taking the next step from the appropriation, we have applied a two-step process to how we then appropriate those funds to the specific projects. So the first step of that is every project has to fall within one of these appropriations, so that we have these categories. These categories exist not just, one, for better monitoring and management of our financial activities, but also to ensure that we're meeting compliance and reporting requirements. So every project has to fall within one of these appropriations. Beyond that, the project then could get applied to a specific project of where those funds will be spent in terms of what we do. The difference between those two tiers is that you could have a project that receives multiple appropriations. So for instance, you could have a property development that pulls housing funds as well as project area funds. So having this categorization in these two tiers within the project allows us to, one, understand all of the sources of funds that come into a project, and then actually reverse engineer that to where if that project doesn't move forward, or we have remaining funds and need to reappropriate them, we will be able to track where those funds came into to then better reallocate them back to the sources that they need to. Again, that's huge when it comes to compliance and reporting, to make sure that we're not violating what we're statutorily required to do as far as the spending of the funds. I'll pause there for a second to see if there's any questions on any of that, or to give Aaron or Ben a chance to correct anything I've gotten wrong so far.
I think the next slide is a helpful illustration.
Okay.
Councilmember,
setup.
Board Member Young.
So I'll just say, not everyone is going to be in this realm, but I am such a fan of clear funding code streams related to being able to track the appropriation of funds. Everything you have outlined is logical, it is rational, and I think it's most importantly something, to your point, that then allows for, whether there's a transition in staff, in council members, in leadership, it provides an opportunity for clarity about where funding is coming from so that we can use the funds appropriately as they were allocated. So I love it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that, because you were talking Aaron speak right now, and so I think she really appreciates that. And when you say everything I've outlined, really is just meaning it's everything that I hope I've absorbed from being told how we're doing this and how we need to do it. And so I'm doing my best. It is a test. It's really just a test to see if I've learned it. But thank you, because that has been the intention. Aaron and the rest of our staff, along with finance, has done an amazing job of even taking some of the framework of the agency even deeper into the workday process for these, because we have that level of reporting that we have to do. So it's good. It's going to be
Mr. Chair,
Board Member Manu.
I'm just glad this is the beauty of a legislative decision-making body, because I'm glad there's someone on our board that understands the depth of bureaucratic financial management. I don't know how to say that, but that was way over my head, and it gives me comfort to know that Board Member Young followed that and is supportive, so I'm glad, because that was confusing to me.
I know now where to direct my comments, so thank you. Sat on the wrong side of the table. Okay, next slide. This is really the meat of what is in the budget amendment. This reflects the changes in the appropriations. You'll see, obviously, as you carry it from the current budget to the proposed budget and the changes in between, this shows that some of the appropriations being reduced, zeroed out, and others are being newly established. Again, want to stress that the overall total budget for all of these appropriations remains unchanged. This is budget neutral. It really just is shifting the appropriations between existing projects and new proposed projects. You'll note that there is a notable shift in what has been the lump sum of these programs, categorized as infrastructure improvements to the creation of the commercial property disposition, and along with that comes the $7.1 million that we're proposing to shift into that appropriation and project. Again, this is primarily a change in what is now providing the program categorization to our appropriations, but also what is the end result of what we're going to propose to use these funds for within those different projects, and we'll get into that detail in a minute. The remainder of the changes essentially keep everything primarily in the infrastructure improvements category and just kind of adjust those appropriations between the depot district and the program income funds. Again, if you look at under the proposed budget column, the first $4 amounts is just the maintaining what is currently within projects that are being spent, holding those constant, and then the last 6 numbers there, starting at the $1 million and going down, those are essentially what will make up the 2 new project appropriations. Any questions on this slide? Okay, next slide. This is essentially at a high level of what is the first new project that is being created. This is categorized as the Station Center Property Disposition and Site Work Project. It is set to receive $8.1 million from both the Depot District and the Program Income Funds. On the left, you can see what are the 3 appropriations that are making up that $8.1 million. This, as it indicates, is tied to actual site work and costs associated with the disposition of property within the Station Center project. So these activities will include the relocation of the state-owned offices and their art, the demolition of that building, soil remediation associated with that site, the building rehabilitation costs proposed for the Serta Mattress building, and then other general site preparation. So this gets into a lot of the specific work that we need to do immediately to start being prepared to dispose of that property. Next slide. The other project that is proposed as part of this amendment is what is considered the Depot District Infrastructure Design. This includes both the design, construction, and site work for the infrastructure that is necessary as part of the, not just within the Depot District, but also within Station Center. You'll note the difference is that this keeps it at a higher level of categorizing it within Depot District, which is the project area, whereas the other one was specific to Station Center property disposition. So this is still kind of maintaining what these allocations have been historically, which is understanding that we have significant infrastructure costs we have to do within Depot for the property redevelopment. So the use of these funds will still be for the design, construction, and site preparation, specifically related to infrastructure and utilities. And then on the left, again, you see the 3 appropriations that are being adjusted to get to that just over $4 million number. So that is the bulk of the budget amendment information, the details on the 2 projects that are being proposed. The next few slides, we have Mr. Chair go into more detail on the workday framework. And so if there's questions from the board and you want to geek out along with Director Young on what is going into Workday, we're happy to provide that information to answer any questions. And at this time, I'll pause there again to look at Aaron and Ben, and if there's anything you want to add or correct.
I would just add, whenever Station Center comes up, the funding gap is something that staff always mentions, because this is a lot of money, but it won't fully fund the entire 2-block project as envisioned. So there'll be future needs for more funding.
And there's no timeline on when this has to be spent by, so we'll be able to accumulate that amount on top of this, or does this all have to be spent out in Station Center by a deadline?
The project area is set to expire, so as per our project area dissolution, there is a time frame, but we have a couple years on that in order to spend it. That's driven more now by state legislation than our own policy. So we do have a couple of years to spend it, and then obviously that will hopefully align with the creation of the HDRZ, which is then what is being proposed to fill the rest of that gap for the infrastructure.
This is the last year of tax increment collection for people.
Turn the mic on.
This is the last year for tax increment for the Depot District. So what will require the HDRZ to start getting on board to fund more of this project.
So it's the last year of collection, but not the last year to spend.
Correct.
Okay.
It's a very important distinction.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chair, this is just the first of an informational briefing. This will come back to you as a board next month for action. I think it's set on your consent agenda later to set the date and time for that.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Moving on. Item C5, this is an informational item. Thank you for accommodating the council's request, the board's request on Japantown visioning process update. Alison will come back to the table, our council policy analyst, to help us frame this this discussion, and Corinne Piazza, senior project manager of the RDA.
Just a brief introduction on this Japantown Street project. I think it predates most of you, if not all of you, on the council/board, although board member Wharton may be the exception, who was here when the Japantown project began.
So we should direct all our questions to Chris
yes.
Wharton. Okay. Be ready for that.
But Corinne has been involved since the beginning, and she will take you through this. This is by way of an update, just so that all of you are aware of the current situation, what the city has invested in Japantown Street, and what it plans to invest in the future. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you. All right, next slide, please. Can I change the slide?
No.
Oh, okay. All right, thank you so much. So today I'm going to briefly go over the project background, and I'll cover the West Quarter project as well as the Japantown design strategy. You really can't talk about one without the other, so that's why I'll start with West Quarter and how we got involved. I'll also go over board involvement, the decisions that you made over the course of the project and the requirements that you placed on it. I'll also go over our outcomes and accomplishments, and then also our current status and what's next. Next slide, please. So for this project, it had a very unique flow of funds. It definitely came to us in a way that we don't usually start our projects, but in 2018, state legislation slated $15 million in transportation funds for regionally significant parking structure, and those funds went to Salt Lake County. Then Salt Lake County and the Ritchie Group requested the creation of a project area, the Block 67 project area, and that the agency pass through those funds to the developer from the state legislation. The agency would then reimburse Salt Lake County on behalf of the Ritchie Group via the tax increment that was generated from the development within the project area, and Salt Lake County would then use the repaid funds for a revolving loan fund to continue to fund regionally significant transportation projects. So the map on the right is the image of the project area, and it's important to note that it's only on the north side of the block. It's not the whole block, so that's why it was in the end called Block 67 North project area. This is because the south side of the block was already pledged to the Eccles bond in the Central Business District. And then the blue parcels are included in phase 1 for West Quarter. Phase 2 is more on that south side. The very slim parcel you can see there marked A is owned by the Salt Lake Buddhist Temple. The parcel to the east of that is owned by the Japanese Church of Christ. And then the further east you go, there's the Salt Lake Buddhist Temple itself. And this all comes into play in later slides. Next slide, please. All right, so the board was very interested in supporting the West Quarter project because its alignment with the downtown master plan. It increased density and housing stock in the downtown. It incorporated a mid-block walkway. It had mixed-use development. It was supporting the creation of a sports and entertainment area. It also provided parking for Delta Center, Salt Palace, and surrounding uses. And it also partnered with Salt Lake County for the long-term viability of the Salt Palace and provided access to good jobs. There's a certain amount of commitments that were required for Phase 1 as well as Phase 2 to reach these downtown master plan goals, including residential, retail, hotel, parking, and office. Next slide, please. Oh.
And just to clarify, this parking structure has not been built yet.
No, it has been built, and the Phase 1 requirements have been met for it so far. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So this project, once it was presented to the board, the Japantown community came with concerns about it. And so historically, the Japantown area was originally about 20 blocks, ranging from North Temple to 4 South and 3rd West to 2nd East. And it was pretty much decimated during urban renewal in the 1960s to make way for the Salt Palace. And the community was concerned because the way the Salt Palace was built, it was very much back of house functions facing Japantown Street. So it kind of turned it into an alley. That's where all the trucks load and unload for Salt Palace. And the West Corridor was designed very similarly, that it was using Japantown more as an alleyway than an important space to be activated. So they felt that it was, if this project went ahead as approved, or as proposed, it was kind of that last nail in the coffin as far as this becoming more of an alley. They also had some good neighbor concerns as far as, with the back of house functions facing Japantown Street, that it could interrupt church functions and the festivals that were really important for the community and the city overall. So in July of 2018, the board actions were, they passed a resolution adopting a Block 67 boundary survey and giving us the go-ahead to start looking into a project area plan. But they also requested that the agency work with the Ritchie Group, Salt Lake County, and the community to figure out how to mitigate impacts of the development on the Japantown community. And I began working with the community in 2018 on our facilitation process. It was about 6 months, and there was 2 main outcomes. Essentially, one, there was an overall wish list of physical improvements to Japantown Street, such as making it more activated, more placemaking, better for festivals. And then 2, the developer proposed significant changes to the West Corridor project to help activate Japantown Street and change that West Corridor was using as back of house. Next slide, please. So with that, after the facilitation process, agency staff proposed 2 paths forward, with focus 1 being taking those pieces that were identified in the facilitation process to mitigate the impacts and tying those into the West Corridor project to really help connectivity to Japantown Street and move that ahead quickly so that the project can continue to move at a good pace. And then focus 2 was a more long-term approach of articulating a vision for Japantown, including establishing a working group and partnering with a design consultant to help the community really focus on what they'd like to see there. So board actions after that, from December 2018 to December 2019, were approved of the identified mitigation steps to move West Corridor forward. They adopted a resolution expressing support for the visioning process and allocated $100,000 in CBD funds for that. Additionally, the board conducted a straw poll for the city council to vote to amend the downtown master plan to recognize Japantown. That's not an RDA specific task, but on a side note. They also approved the city and county interlocal agreements for the project area, as well as the West Corridor tax increment reimbursement agreement with the Ritchie Group, including the mutually agreed upon concessions for Japantown, which are in that legal document. The graphic on the right is essentially from a 2018 memo of the paths that we've taken since. Next slide, please. All right, so the board requirements for participation in the West Corridor project were broken down into these 3 pieces for Japantown, and essentially it was design improvements, so creating a setback for the northwest corner to activate Japantown Street. The community had expressed it was interested in its own economic development and using its parcels to develop in the future, but they're very small, and the parking that they would need would really limit what they could do. So the developer built the parking garage with knockout panels next to the church's property so that if they do develop, they can connect to the parking in the future. They also moved the loading functions into the building so that they weren't on the street. And the good faith conditions were next. This was essentially just being a good neighbor, helping to schedule trash pickup around festivals and church activities in the festivals, activating the street with retail along 100 South and landscaping as well. And then the adjacent property improvements were a big piece. So those parcels I talked about that the two churches owned, originally the project was proposed with a 12-foot wall between West Quarter and those parcels due to the grade difference. So the developer proposed on his own, to his own cost, to regrade and repave the church's parcels so that it's all flush. And now there is no longer a wall, and there's a connection between the mid-block walkway for West Quarter and Japantown Street. And let's see, and then on the right side of the slide, those are the project requirements that we briefly talked about, with mid-block walkway, public parking stalls, certain conditions for phase 2, the conditions for Japantown, and we also put a 10% set aside of tax increment for Japantown Street improvements. Next slide, please. So diving into the Japantown design strategy process itself, we partnered with GSPS Architects, and it was a very extensive process we did for a year. We started with that wish list I mentioned that came from the facilitation process as really where everyone started brainstorming. We identified community captains in a subcommittee, so the graphic on the side shows how everyone's role played together. So the center one is our Japantown representatives. These are folks that we called our community captains that represented the Japanese Church of Christ, the Salt Lake Buddhist Temple, and the Japanese Community Preservation Committee. And these are the three strong organizations on Japantown Street today. There's also a subcommittee of about 20 community members that helped distill ideas and feedback that we heard. The larger Japanese American community was invited to participate as well. And then, of course, the largest circle being all area stakeholders and anyone who uses the street, from Salt Palace to a resident attending a festival. So the outcomes were we identified a vision, goals, and design guidelines for Japantown Street, the community's main priorities, their preferred street design, phasing to accomplish that design, and a preliminary budget estimate. And the final Japantown design strategy was presented in April 2021 to the board. Next slide, please. Just the document itself is really beautiful. There's a lot of pieces to it. You can find it on the RDA's website, but I'll just touch on some of the high-level pieces that came out of it. So Japantown's vision and goals were to preserve future economic development and tourism opportunities for the community, allow the churches to grow and thrive, and preserve and create something for future generations of Japanese Americans. Also create placemaking, design a festival street, create a non-church related gathering place, and improve walkability. Overall, their vision was Okaga Samade, which is I am who I am because of you, and they wanted it to be a place of remembrance and respect that thrives over time, and a place of inclusion. And then finally, their design guideposts, which are really established so that over the next 10, 20 years, as improvements are made, they can look back and say, this was our goal and this is what they should touch on, are a place of vibrancy, a place of generations, a place of gathering, senses, and intrinsic beauty. Next slide, please. So the design strategy itself was broken down into 3 phases. The graphic on the right and the image on the very bottom is the final design, or excuse me, final outcome. And it's phase 1, 2, and 3. And the preferred concept the community came up with identifies their priorities, which are functionality, safety, and placemaking. There's phase progression, and each phase builds on itself. So as we receive funds or are able to allocate funds, we can work on it without having to remove something once we do a different phase. And yeah, each phase builds towards that final vision. Also, each phase includes elements of each type of item that the community was had prioritized. So essentially, they didn't have to wait till the very last phase to see placemaking or some of the more exciting things. There was a little bit in each phase so that they could see progress. The preliminary estimates came in at about $7.5 million, but this was in 2020, so we already know this is going to be way more expensive than that. And that was not intended to be a final estimate, but just a starting place for everyone to understand what the vision would cost and what our next steps would be. Next slide, please. I think this is the last slide for Japantown design strategy, and it's not a final concept, but just an idea of what it could look like with all of the ideas in place. And it also talks about the main placemaking elements that were a priority. So functional, these are your benches and bollards that may have a great design to them, history and storytelling elements that talk about this historical importance of the area, and art elements as well. And they identified art entryway elements as very important, and potentially 2 on each end. Next slide, please. All right, this is the last slide, and this is our status update. So right now, our existing funds that are in action are, we have $250,000. We've partnered with GSBS, and we're working on design documents for phase 1 through 3. This gets us closer to that ultimate question of what does it cost, and how do we get to the next phase of funding. We're convening a city committee of city departments that would be involved. So transportation, engineering, because ultimately it wouldn't be an RDA project as far as leading construction. We also have $100,000 in public art, and we're working with Arts Council. Renato and his team have been amazing, brainstorming with us on how we'll kick off doing a call for an artist, and that artist working with the community to design the initial entryway monuments. Important to note is $100,000 is enough to fund all 4 entryway monuments, but it would be essentially coming up with the design. So because we know we do need more funds, we proposed in budget requests for fiscal year 25, $100,000 more to allow us to complete construction documents for phase 1, and then also $300,000 more in public art. We also have project area tax increment coming in for the first time this year. We don't have a exact estimate yet, but that will be coming in, and we anticipated from the original agreement that that would help fund public infrastructure on Japantown Street. And then finally, we always have an ongoing partnership with the community. We'll be tabling at the Nihon Matsuri Festival Saturday, April 27th, and we do that every year with them, and talk about the design strategy and what the current status is. We also actually have some really cool features that came out. The University of Utah magazine featured the project and its commitment to keeping all different voices at the table in development. Then we also just, the RDA and GSBS won the APA Utah Beehive Award of Excellence, which has been issued for the first time and represents the pinnacle of planning in the state, and again was given for the thoughtful consideration of all stakeholders being involved in problem solving. So that is it, if everyone has any questions.
I had a few questions. You mentioned the tax reimbursement agreement. Do you mind explaining if that's going directly injected capital back to the businesses, or is it just infrastructure related?
No, so we're keeping 10% comes to the
Correct.
RDA, and it's for infrastructure improvements associated with the design strategy. So it's kind of 2 paths. We knew we'd eventually be able to collect the 10%, so we worked on the vision to make sure once we have that funding, it can tie into the community's vision.
Okay, and we haven't released an RFP or anything on this project. When we're talking about reimbursement or infrastructure investment, it's just the street itself. There's no other properties we're talking about directly.
Correct. It's all public property. So
Okay.
we would use, the tax increment for public property, not private.
Okay, thank you.
Come.
Mr. Chair, thank you so much for your leadership on this throughout the years and for briefing us all again. I've been following this project for obvious reasons, and I am hopeful that as we are focusing on downtown, we can, and this part of our city, we can really get this project off the ground. And my question is, the $7.5 million, it was the estimate, whatever the case may be, in terms of 10%, if we're just putting our money in a bank account and waiting, it seems like it's going to be a long time before the 10% tax increment becomes enough. Have we considered bonding against that tax increment in order to fund that project up front, and where have those discussions gone?
I don't think we've discussed that at this point, and you're absolutely correct. I don't think that the 10% would ever be enough for the whole vision. But I think that's what we were able to put aside as one of potentially many funding streams. We also tried to leave it open that we had additional partners, hopefully the county, because we felt like if they were investing in this area, it'd also show, that it's an important place in, as far as the Salt Palace and their relationship. So we knew the 10% wouldn't only fund this solely, but we were hoping to have additional funding streams as well as potentially other partners as well.
Yeah, I would I would like to consider and look into bonding against our tax increment on that, or other sources to repay the bond that could help us both ensure that we know where that tax increment is going to be going in the future, but also to be able to get the project started quicker. And absolutely, let's communicate with the county. And I'm not sure the best way to do that, but I'd love staff and council staff's guidance on how to begin that conversation with the county, because obviously they're a major landowner. The county actually owns the land under the Japanese garden that's on the north side of the property, and that's something that's, I think, really important and interesting, and so they have a history of supporting Japantown goals and actually dedicating some of the land that they own next to the Salt Palace for those purposes. So I'd love to figure out how to have those conversations, as you mentioned. Excellent.
And GSBS is including them in our design document process as well. So they'll be at the table and talking about how, the traffic flows and everything on that street. They were part of the initial design strategy, but now that we're moving into design documents and getting into more details, we want them at the table to make sure it's designed in a way that works for loading for Salt Palace as well.
Yeah, and I would like to add to that, support from my side about bonding for this project and moving that ahead, since there was so much work done and so much community input, and it would be disappointing to wait too long to make this happen. So I think that makes a lot of sense to me. Any other thoughts? Councilmember Petrie?
Well, I'm supportive of that, definitely supportive of the bonding. Do we have a mechanism for responsiveness to new opportunities that might be presented as this part of the city is under a magnifying glass and there might be things that we could never have considered? I mean, I think this is beautiful, but I would hate to miss out on other possibilities, especially if we're going to bond and be more expansive with the vision there.
That's actually an interesting conversation to have as well. And only this project, as far as I know, is only about street typology, and many of the conversations we've been having are dreaming something bigger than that. And I wonder if there is a possibility to add to that.
I think it just reinforces the need to make sure that as the conversations about what are going to happen in that area unfold, making sure that the city represents that this is an active plan that we are actively pursuing it's going to be paramount. And then also making sure that the Japanese American community leaders that you've referenced also have meaningful avenues for input that are responded to in ways that are substantial.
Board Member Lopez.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think you mentioned the working group. There's lots of individuals that feel their voice is not at the forefront of this. So as I've met with constituents and wanting to support Councilmember Mano also in this, this is a priority. I wanted to echo your comments, based on the legislative session. We know, as you mentioned, there's a lot of different actors. I'd like to know, Danny or RDA, do you see the city acting quicker and helping point that arrow in direction? Because I think one of the things that I've seen, just in my limited experience, has been, as we invest, we really are going to dictate the private capital that comes in and enters as it develops around Japantown. But I'd like to, state that they're building around Japantown, not that Japantown is being built around them. I think that's something that I really want the RDA to understand and prioritize.
Thank you for the update. Danny, you wanted to chime in?
I just wanted to provide a little context to the bonding conversation. I think Corinne's point is probably the most important takeaway, is that the RDA funding was really meant to be a piece of what is probably going to be a much larger capital stack. To pull this project off, as Corinne said, the 2020 cost estimate was $7.5 million. You're probably looking at almost double of that. In terms of when you really get into it. For reference, over the life of the project area, it's projected that the Block 67 project area may generate between 8 to 10 to or $11 million. So if we get 10% of that, you're looking at best of $1 million of what is arguably a $15 million project. So I don't know if that's something that the RDA can lead out in terms of a bonding, but certainly the tax increment can be part of that larger capital stack of where we may look at funding for that. So.
Thank you. That helps.
I guess speaking both as a board member of the RDA and as a council member, I would like us to look at all the different types of funding that we control as the city and the RDA and see what would be appropriate for this area, while still, of course, also trying to get participation from other outside agencies. But I don't want us to limit to what we can do with the 10% of the tax increment on just the Block 67 North project. I want us to look at a wider array of potential funding strategies if possible, just because this is timely and important and something that is, I think, really critical. And I want to say thank you to the council members that have shared support for that and for your comments today. It's really important to me, and it means a lot. Thank you.
Thank you for that update. We wanted to be at the same level on knowledge, except that Chris knows more about this for sure. I mean, you've been involved in it longer, but we wanted to have some sort of base of knowledge on where we are on the visioning for Japantown. Moving on to item C6, report and announcements from Executive Director. I don't think there is any. Thank you. Report announcement from RDA staff. I saw that we got some of those. Danny.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We do. We have quite a few updates. First off is wanted to update the board that the Station Center Vision and Implementation Plan is nearing completion. This will come to you as a board next month. In the meantime, staff has been busy fielding interest in the project and providing updates, as there's a lot of excitement around what is happening in the neighborhood. We're also already working on the next steps in terms of implementation, moving forward with the design of infrastructure, as well as preparing to market the properties in the near future as that plan comes out. Also, not to steal any thunder from Director Young, but I tried to assure her that we were getting ready to come to the board in April for an update on, along with transportation and UTA, for an update on the S-Line extension. That is obviously right adjacent to the RDA's property in Sugar House, so we will provide an update on that. UTA is anticipating beginning construction this summer, and we're working with them on some of the pre-development steps. That includes relocation of some of the remaining facilities on the property, as well as some property ownership transfer and plat updates. And Director Young, I don't know if Tracy had a chance to mention, but she indicated to me that we're trying to get on the April agenda with the Sugar House Community Council. So there's an update on that. We have 4 requests for proposals to update you as the board on. The first is the Salt Lake County RFP that was seeking a real estate developer partner for the redevelopment of the Sunday Anderson Senior Center. Closed, received 3 proposals. RDA and county staff reviewed the proposals, and the project has been awarded to a partnership of the nonprofits Utah Community Action and Developed by Women under the name of the Sunday Legacy Development, LLC. So they're anticipated to begin negotiations with the county on that, but that was recently just awarded, and as you'll recall, that you as a board put funding in that. That will be part of that project. Also, with respect to the Ballpark Next process, the RDA issued an RFP and received 6 proposals for a consultant to provide human-centered design and an urban design framework for the ballpark properties. Selection committee is in the process of reviewing those applications and selecting someone who we hope will be at the end of next month. RDA also issued an RFP for an environmental consultant to provide brownfield cleanup activities for the property we own on Jeremy Street over adjacent to the Folsom Corridor. This project will be funded by a $500,000 grant from the EPA Brownfields program. And our goal is to hopefully convert that building into neighborhood scale commercial space right adjacent to Folsom Corridor. And then finally, RDA also has an RFP open right now seeking architects, land use planners, and urban designers and landscape architects to fill the on-call design services where we maintain contracts with consultants so that we can call them as needed for projects. This will be a multiple award RFP for no more than 5 firms, and that closes on April 5th. And finally, on sad news, Corinne Piazza is leaving the RDA. Boo, exactly. So, no. Corinne's a senior project manager. She's been with the agency for 6 years. She will be headed back east to do economic development work for the town of Groton. And she assures us that despite the name and the fact that it's only 40,000 people, that it very much is the hub of economic development in Connecticut. So, So, we are small name place, yes. We're extremely sad to see her leave. Corinne has been a huge part of our culture. If you know anything about Corinne, you know that we all live vicariously through her adventures. And this move will allow her to be closer to her parents and on the beach, as she is happy to remind all of us that she'll be spending more time. So she assures us she will still be available for contact, but I recommend that you follow the tides in the Connecticut area because that'll be based on whether she's out surfing or not. So Corinne's more notable projects with the RDA is, as you saw, Japantown. She also led the public art projects, Granary Mural Program, Art for Hope during the COVID crisis, and then has been the centerpiece of everything related to Ballpark Next in terms of the design competition framework and now moving into what are the next steps. So she will be greatly missed. That's all we have. Mr. Chair, members of the board, any questions? Happy to answer them.
I wanted to thank you for, I wanted to thank all the whole staff and those that are here today and they might be leaving for your work. Specifically, on your updates, I wanted to mention the Sandy Anderson one. And, thank you for the work that, the crazy idea of collaborating between county and a private entity and envisioning something bigger and inserting ourselves and telling you to insert yourself and the RDA staff and something that some people will say is none of our business, and seeing something better there, it's a big deal. So thank you for that. And the question on the architect, the work done on the landscape architects for the Jordan River. You said it closes on April 15th, the RFP for that, or?
Yeah, this is RFP for just us to have multiple firms under contract for any type of work. So it's not specific to any project as much as just when we need a random site plan or renderings or something to engage an architect and not have to go out to RFP because it's a smaller scope project.
That makes sense. Thank you so much. Anybody else? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And we're moving to item D, which is written briefings. There is some of those written briefings in there. If you have any questions or thoughts or concerns about those, please bring them about now. Item D1 is the informational semi-annual status report on RDA commercial loan portfolio. If anybody has any thoughts about that. Moving on to item E, the consent agenda sets the date for resolution RDA budget amendment number 2 for fiscal year 2023-2024. We're going to have to need a motion to approve that consent.
Mr. Chair, I move to approve the consent agenda.
I have a motion by Board Member Dugan and a second by Board Member Wharton. Any discussion on that? All of those say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that motion passes unanimously, and then we don't have anything else on the agenda. Thank you, everyone. When are we reconvening, Madam Chair?
We're supposed to do 4:15. Let's give ourselves till 4:20. We'll be back by 4:20.
How generous.
Be back by 4:20.
Oh, my goodness. Okay, we feel it. 4:20.